This morning, I thought I would follow up on yesterday's entry by talking about Mathew Franklin Whittier as a child prodigy. The earliest physical piece that I have is this, which I've shown before, is the New England Galaxy. And this is the December, I believe it's 16th. I got to get on my glasses. 1825 edition. I identified Mathew's work. He's 12 years old, and I identified the first of it in the spring of 1825 in this newspaper, the New England Galaxy. There's a deep history to this. He didn't sign with his name, so I can prove it in the overall context of what I know about his work, having studied 2,300 plus of his published works over the last 11 years. I can definitely say that this is Mathew. Proving it to anybody else is a little difficult. What I thought I'd do was just read a little bit of one of the pieces. There's two here in this paper. Understanding that I am convinced that this is Mathew, but trying to convince anybody else would be an uphill battle. But let's just get a feel for what I believe he sounded like at this age. Later on, in a couple minutes, I will go into something that I have more evidence for. For the New England Galaxy, Mr. Buckingham, sir, the following is an attempt not to persuade anyone, but perhaps to induce a reader of your Galaxy, now and then, by recurring to facts to make out his own persuasion. If you should think that the real and good intent the zeal, rather, and good intent compensate for the various defects of style and expression, you will oblige me by inserting this essay. If, however, you should condemn it, my feelings will be but slightly injured, and no great wrong will be done to the rising generation. Yours with respect, and he signs a subscriber. Now, note that we definitely know that this is a young author, okay, because he talks about the rising generation. So that narrows down drastically the number of people that could be writing this, because not that many young people can write like this. I'll just get a little ways into this one. On the high-cried blasphemy of Lord Byron's writings. Now, I do know that Mathew quoted Byron very often throughout his career, so obviously liked him and defended him. Loud and frequent have been the assaults upon the character, and bitter the moral criticisms upon the writings of Lord Byron. His name has been considered synonymous with infidel impiety and fiend-like blasphemy. The anxious parent, while stamping the first idea of deity and excellence onto the infant's mind, has taught him to fear this noble poet as though he were the fallen archangel, and to detest his writings as a snare to virtue and as subversive of all good principles. His name has been a chiding byword with the waking mother, by which to still the cry of the innocent and unknowing babe. Thus a deep, unfounded, and lasting prejudice is planted in the puerile mind. Thus, the germ of a causeless hatred toward an object unknown sends forth its poisonous tendrils in the youthful breast. Okay, so that is Mathew at age, well, let's see, December 16, 1825. He'd be 13 years old. There's a backstory to this, and that is that he is from a Quaker family. He's run away from home by this time, but he's from a Quaker family, and they're rather Puritan. Matter of fact, I've made the point many times that they're really more Puritan than Quaker in their attitudes, in my opinion. Everybody assumes that the Whittiers are Quakers, but you look a little closer and they look pretty much Puritan to me. But anyway, the important point here is that John Greenleaf Whittier was very down on Byron. So a lot of times when Mathew writes, it looks as though he's just picked a topic and is writing to the public, but it really is some personal argument or discussion that's gone on between him and his brother, later on, between him and Abby, and it prompts him to write, and then that gets published. So I would guess that that is the case here. Now, again, I can't prove that this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's. He signs it Phyllis Potrea, or Potria, which when I looked it up, it means a philosopher poet, but it's in the feminine, if I'm not mistaken. I'm guessing that he just didn't know. At age 12, he had an education of sorts, but it wasn't enough for him to know that that was in the feminine. It's just a guess. Now, before we get into the one that I can prove more definitely, let's look at what Mathew Franklin Whittier's plagiarists were doing, what their first works were. There's 4 of the major ones. There's a lot of small, minor ones, which I'm not really emphasizing right now because basically I want to cause a stir, I want to create a little controversy out there, so I'm hitting the big ones, the outrageous claims, for Mathew, who is my past life self. I'm purposely trying to be outrageous for anybody that wonders why I'm doing that. Let's see. Margaret Fuller, she was born in 1810. Her first published work was at age 24 at her father's request. I've got my notes here. She published an article about a slavery-related incident, it was published in the Boston Daily Advertiser. Now, as I read Margaret Fuller, she was quite intelligent. She was bright, but it was her father who pushed her to be a genius, like little league parent syndrome. I had that happen to me when I was a kid. My father very badly wanted me to be what he couldn't be, which is a star tennis player. My father took up tennis at about age 40 and was excellent. He was like a human backboard. And I distinctly remember this scene when, I would be brought along when he was playing tennis on the weekends, this little Miami Coconut Grove, they're concrete courts, right? And these cast of characters would come out and play. Well, there was this young college kid who was a hot shot who came out to just show, how good he was, I guess. And he couldn't beat my father because my father got everything back. And I remember the guy got furious with himself. He was yelling at himself like John McEnroe, except not at the referee, but at himself, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Why can't you hit? What's wrong with your game is falling apart and all that stuff. It was just that my father always got one more back than he did, which is how you win in tennis. See? But he very much wanted me. See, he started so late that he really didn't have a chance to be a tennis star, and his strokes weren't all that, polished and so on. So he wanted me to do that, want to do that through me. And I liked it, and I had some talent, but I didn't have the kind of talent that, would have been required for that. And I resented the pressure, Well, that apparently was the situation with Margaret Fuller and her father. He created, like Pygmalion, he created a genius who really wasn't a genius. And this is why she was under pressure to claim Mathew's work when he wrote as the star for the New York Tribune, and also to claim the F-signed work in the Dial. Now, I was interested to see that apparently Ralph Waldo Emerson actually believed that she was writing the F-signed material in the Dial, but they really weren't that close as near as I can tell. I mean, Emerson agreed to contribute one piece per issue, as I've read the history, and he would send it in. She was the editor. Nobody was paid. They had trouble getting work, because it wasn't paid. And Mathew ended up with the job of writing the reviews, which is the lowest job on a paper, on an unpaid journal, see? But he was so good that he made real literature of it, and she got famous based on it. The same thing happened in the New York Tribune from 1844 in the fall until mid-1846, when Mathew was writing as a freelancer, as an anonymous freelancer, the star-signed reviews and essays. He'd been using that star since 1830. Rumor got out that because she was the literary editor, she must have been the author. She didn't quell the rumor. She let it develop and eventually claimed that work. She even claimed it to her aunt early on, apparently, when her aunt asked her about it. So she couldn't resist, having been raised with that kind of pressure to be a genius, she couldn't resist claiming the work when the real author didn't step forward. So it's kind of understandable in a way. But anyway, her first published work was at age 24. Then we get to Edgar Allan Poe, born 1809, and he's a bird because he stole so much of his published work. It's very difficult to tell what's his and what isn't. So it's very difficult to to analyze and appreciate the work of a massive plagiarist because you don't know what's his. My take of it is that he published Tamerlane and Other Poems in 1827 when he would have been 16. I just looked at that again just before I started here, and I think he probably did write Tamerlane. It looks brash and egotistical. He's very bright, very clever. He thinks a great deal of himself. He's kind of protesting to his foster father. And he thinks he's a genius at any rate, whether he is or not. And it's a kind of a disjointed style. I wouldn't know how to describe it. It seems very bright. It doesn't seem inspired, and it seems very egotistical. So I would guess he wrote that. I do not think that he wrote Al-Araf. I think he plagiarized that. And when he gave a reading in Boston in 1845, he was commissioned to read something new, and he didn't. He read this old poem, Al-Araf, and tried to pass it off as a new poem. Scholars have interpreted that as like a practical joke. I don't think it was a practical joke. I think he really intended to pass that off as something new because he not only had not gotten it together to write a new poem, he was incapable of writing a new poem to the standard that the Boston literati were expecting. So the other thing he did was the copy of the compilation, Al-Araf, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems, the copy that he used, he tried to alter the date from 1829 to 1820 to prove that he was a child prodigy. Well, understandably, Poe fans and scholars have not understood the depth of his deception. They always make excuses for him, but this guy is a sociopath. He even sounds like a sociopath in Tamerlane, in my opinion. But, I mean, this guy was full of tricks, and he knew how to create a backstory, an artificial backstory, like he did in the philosophy of composition, where he created a phony backstory for having supposedly written The Raven. That's how tricky this guy was. He was tricky enough to falsely claim The Raven and scooped it by a day or two, when Matthew's version of it came out. That's the kind of personality you're dealing with. But there is, I think, a scrap of paper that he wrote at age 15 that's attributed to him. But as I read the history, there's no way to prove that he actually wrote that, only that he physically did the handwriting. He wrote it down, but there's no way to know that he composed it per se. So I don't consider that very strong evidence. It doesn't sound like him to me. Given that he's a sociopath, it doesn't sound like him. Now, and I know all this stuff's going to offend a lot of people. It's unavoidable. I can't help offending people because I intend to reclaim Matthew's work from these plagiarists that got famous off it. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was born in 1806. Her earliest published work, as I understand, is an essay on mind with other poems, which she published at age 20 in 1826. Well, that's hardly a child prodigy, but I don't believe for an instant that she wrote that poem, an essay on mind, and I have many reasons for that. I believe that Matthew and Abby thought she had written it, and that's why they sent her work, see? But because they would have been very much simpatico with the real author of that poem. It talks about, it's not an essay on mind at all. The themes are genius and the fate of a genius who's speaking for himself, and the history of genius, and that's a theme that was very dear to Matthew's heart. So he would have resonated with that poem, and if he believed that she had written it, he would have thought she was a kindred spirit, see, but she didn't write it. I think she picked it up at an estate sale someplace from some male genius poet who had passed on. That's my guess. It's just an extrapolation. But anyway, that was at age 20. Charles Dickens was born the same year as Matthew, 1812. His first published story, as I understand, not counting some like legal reporting and stuff, was Dinner at Poplar Walk. That was published 1833 at age 21. Once again, that's hardly a child prodigy, and it's very trite, if you ask me. I mean, I've read it, tried to read it, and it's social comedy, and there's not an ounce of depth in it, or philanthropy, either one. And I am of the opinion, unless somebody goes through a major conversion experience, like they have a near-death experience and they come back and, become a changed person with totally different values, basically what you see at the beginning is what you're going to get later on. And Matthew's earliest work compares very favorably to his last work 50 years later. It's the same person with the same values and the same, the way his mind works and so on is basically the same. So I don't believe that Charles Dickens started out as trivial as that and suddenly became a profound author, maybe. Matthew did undergo a change as far as stereotypes and being prejudiced, against certain minorities and things like that. His view about abolition changed. Abby radicalized him in the good sense. So when they started going together, and by the time they were married in 1836, Matthew had changed his views from being in favor of colonization, sending black people to Africa, to new countries, from that to abolition, immediate abolition of slavery. And that was, I think, mostly her influence. But I don't see how Charles Dickens could have gotten from Dinner at Poplar Walk to some of the things he did a little bit later on, unless he was deriving his ideas from other people, which in fact he was. That's in my article. So with the possible exception of Edgar Allan Poe, I don't see that any of these people were child prodigies. And I think Edgar Allan Poe rather made too much of it, given that I think that he plagiarized Al-Araf. Now, Matthew, on the other hand, was writing sophisticated work at age 12, and we're going to prove it as far as a little bit later is concerned, a little bit older. This is the personal memoirs of Joseph T. Buckingham. It was Mr. Buckingham that Matthew was writing to in that first piece that I just read to you. This was originally published in 1852. This is a later publication. Let's see, I don't remember when this was, 1957 or something like that. And on page 252, he is talking about the New England Galaxy, and he's talking about the young writers that used to write for him. And here he says, while the Galaxy was thus conducted, the labors of the editors were lightened by the contributions of Moses Whitney, Jr., a young gentleman engaged in mercantile pursuits. His pieces are signed, quote, Trismegistus. He had written many brief paragraphs for the paper in years preceding, under various signatures, generally on light and transient topics, which had no other importance or claim to notice than that they afforded opportunities for the exhibition of the wit and humor for which their author was celebrated. Well, you can make your own decision on that. I think he gives Matthew short shrift, but Matthew apparently swore every editor he worked for to secrecy, but some of them would get around it. B.P. Shillaber, editor of the Carpetbag, appears to have flat out lied in his memoirs, and he attributed Trismegistus in that publication, 1851 to 1853, to a career academic named Benjamin Drew, who also wrote part-time for the Post, which Shillaber had also done. He'd edited the Post. But Matthew had used Trismegistus first in the 1828 New England Galaxy. He briefly used it again in a paper called the New York Transcript in 1835. We don't need to go into that one. But this Moses Whitney, this is Mathew Whittier. He's disguised the name slightly. I believe the reason he did this is when he wrote this memoir, Matthew was publishing as Trismegistus in the Carpetbag, and it was getting famous. His characters, the military hero caricature, Ensign Jehiel Stebbings, and then the caricature of academia, the academic philosopher, Dr. E. Gertie Digg, those were becoming quite popular. And nobody knew at that time who was supposed to have written them. But Buckingham knew that this was Mathew Franklin Whittier, who was once again pulling out Trismegistus. So he couldn't resist putting some reference into his memoirs, I think, that Trismegistus originally appeared in his New England Galaxy, but he had to disguise the name. So he's got the first initial the same, and in the second name, the first four letters, W-H-I-T, are the same. So Clearly, it's a reference to Mathew Franklin Whittier disguised, but then he says, a young gentleman engaged in mercantile pursuits. Well, that narrows it way down. Mathew was pursuing not only a literary career, but a mercantile career. And I think the main reason he did this, ultimately, maybe not right at the beginning, but the reason he pursued it, I think, was because he wanted to ask for Abby's hand in marriage. Her father was a marquis. He was very class conscious. He was never going to give permission for Mathew to marry. If you watched my video all the way to the end yesterday, you will have seen where Mathew gives kind of a stylized, metaphorical account of that relationship and their problem with her parents, her father. So Mathew was writing as Trismegistus in the Galaxy, and he was also pursuing a mercantile career. As I said, that narrows it way down. But then there's another reference. He had written many brief paragraphs for the paper in years preceding under various signatures. Well, that's just kind of thrown in. Matter of fact, I even missed it when I was reading it here. But that's not that common. Mathew wrote under all sorts of different signatures and kept anonymous. Well, some people did that. You know, maybe when they were writing in, they would sign something that was just topical. You know, if they're writing about dairy cows, they would write dairy farmer. That was their signature, you know. But Mathew would take these pseudonyms and then he would launch another one, and there'd be 4 or 5 running at the same time in the same paper. The Carpetbag has maybe 8 different ones, you know. So in the New England Galaxy, I am convinced that NNK, which probably stood for Never Never Know, as in like deep cover, was his. That was his go-to signature in the Galaxy. But he also wrote as Trismegistus. He also wrote with variations of his PP signatures, like Peter Pumpkin, you know, was his nickname. So he would write Peter this or Peter that. There's a few of those in there. But Trismegistus we have mentioned by the editor in his memoir. So that's the one we're going to go with, because that one we can be pretty much sure is his. And by the way, in the next paragraph, he says that all of these young men are dead. So, you know, Buckingham, of course, was Edwin, his son. Then Holbrook, Whitney, and Locke, supposedly they all died. Well, Mathew hadn't died. So I think that's just a red herring. But I have to mention it to be precise here. So let us say, and I have more evidence by the topics and the style and everything else that Trismegistus was in fact Mathew. I can prove it many times over. But we have some objective evidence for that, so that's the one I'm going to go with. So now I have Kindle. I took off the child's cover to make it a little more professional looking. We're going to start with the first of 4. Trismegistus appears, I believe it's the first time in the Galaxy, in the February 29, 1828 edition. Mathew is 15 years old. His birthday is July 18th, so he's 15. This is a long article. I can't read all of it. By the way, for the people that leave comments on my on these entries, a lot of times their questions are answered deep into the entry, you know, like maybe at minute 40 or minute 50 or something, if it's a 60-minute video. So it suggests to me that these people are not watching the entire presentation, because I address these things later on. So if you want to comment, I strongly suggest watching the entire video so you know what you're commenting on. So here, I'll just read a little bit of it and then I'll skip through. But I should preface this by saying, keep in mind that Mathew's brother, 5 years older, is John Greenleaf Whittier, a world-class poet, one of the fireside poets. That means that they would have had the same schooling, both at home and in the schoolroom. And they also had access to a private library. Dr. Elias Weld in Rocks Village let John Greenleaf Whittier use his private library. Mathew would have been able to tag along at age 10 or whatever it was. So they had the same privileges, and Mathew had the benefit of probably being tutored in poetry by his brother. So we're not talking someone that has no background in poetry as a child. So here he writes at age 15, Mr. Editor, I am an insatiable reader of true poetry, That is to say, I read whatever is published at the present day and think myself all the while very profitably occupied. Now remember, he's tongue-in-cheek a lot of times, so you have to be on the lookout for him being sarcastic. It constitutes as large a proportion of our literary atmosphere as oxygen does of common air. No man can live in modern times without breathing in modern poetry, and no man can breathe it in without feeling its effects. It is in this circumstance, without doubt, that we transcend our forefathers and all the world beside, that have lived from Homer's time down to the present era. As to the Augustan age, a comparison cannot fairly be drawn between Ovid, Horace, Virgil on the one side, and our own illustrious poets on the other. We must wait till the latter have acquired their immortality like the former. We must make the comparison 2,000 years hence. Even now, however, it may be safely said that we have 40 poets where Greece and Rome had one. During the Augustan age of England, indeed, Milton, Dryden, and others of the old school published some volumes of verse, which, to be candid, is quite tolerable, considering the barbarism of those times and their own lack of education. But that our poets can surpass them all is logically proved by the fact that they do surpass them, instead of starting anything new, as many did whose names are already mentioned. They take up their predecessors' writings and improve upon them, wiping the dust from old songs, sonnets, plays, and ballads not generally read, and brushing them over with new colors till they appear like so many clowns in a gentleman's dress. So it sounds to me like he's being sarcastic about modern poetry. You get a sense of his style. You get a sense of his education, even at this point. Whereas I don't know these things. I haven't studied the poets of past ages. I don't have a liberal education. My education is in counseling and human systems. I don't know the rules of poetry or grammar even. I know how to write. I know good poetry when I see it, but I don't know all the technical rules, because the intuitive part came through into this lifetime, but the cognitive skills, this cognitive knowledge did not. So, but Mathew had these things. He had a good education and continued to educate himself. Abby, who was a child prodigy who had an upper class French style education, also tutored him. So he had these things. Now, here's satire. He's talking about someone who had recently published a compilation, or was intending to publish a compilation of poetry. And this could have to do with Edgar Allan Poe's first effort, or it might not, because Mathew was in Boston. Let me see if I can pick this up somewhere. This ambition of inventing something new, either in the matter or the manner of their verse, will be better understood by an instance. I know a young man of great expectations who has just commenced his poetical career with a dream in blank verse 3 columns long, so true to nature that you might believe he had caught his fancies in the very act, so insinuating that I could never for the life of me read so much as the first 10 lines without snoring. So you see something of Mathew's sarcasm. The public will be glad to learn that his friends have induced him to prepare an octavo volume for the press, of which the following pieces, copied from his table of contents, will constitute a chief part. I think if Poe is included in this, I think it's just as a class, not necessarily directly at him. So here we have the examples that come from the table of contents of the upcoming young man's volume. Ode for Muster Day, written by request and sung with great applause. Well, Mathew was a Quaker, and he very often ridiculed musters or military exercises, local military exercises. Anacreontic Serenade. I don't know what anacreontic means. Stanzas in heroic measure on a mammoth calf, capitals, seen at a cattle show. Allegory in 6 cantos, immortality of the soul. Tragedy in 2 acts, bloody murder of 6 militiamen. 40 pages of monologues, epigrams, and acrostics. I don't know what acrostics is either. The rear is brought up by an elegy on the death of my great-grandmother at the age of 103 in the measure of Hudibras. I don't know. I've just heard of Hudibras. I don't know what his measure is like. So that gives you an idea of his understanding of poetry. He goes on and on. He quotes poetry. He comments. It's a long, long, erudite piece. Very well written. One wonders, and it's signed Trismegistus. Could it possibly have been written by a 15-year-old? Yes, it was. Okay, Matthew is a child prodigy. He's a literary genius. It's perfectly reasonable that he could have written these pieces that I claim for him. Okay? You know, I could read this whole thing and provide more evidence thereby, but I think I won't. Let's go on to the next one. The May 30, 1828 edition. We have Trismegistus again. By the way, Trismegistus, of course, is a reference to Hermes. This reflects the tutoring that Abby must have been giving him even at this early stage. She was teaching him the Greek classics, and she was teaching him French and German and various other things, but she was also slipping in her knowledge of metaphysics. And what he got of it was not very much at the beginning because he was skeptical. But he picked up the name Trismegistus, which means thrice great, and it amused him, so he used it as a signature. Later on, he understood these things. This is my interpretation. Now, here we have May 30, 1828. He is writing, this is very early. This is a style that Seba Smith picked up later on with regard to Jackson, because Seba Smith wrote a whole biography of Andrew Jackson, tongue-in-cheek. Well, this is a tongue-in-cheek letter to the editor as though he were a Jackson man, okay? But it's satire. This is a technique that Matthew honed later on in his career. There's an example of it from his own paper, the Salisbury Monitor, with regard to dueling, that was reprinted in the Liberator, in William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator. So here he says, Mr. Editor, being a zealous Jacksonian, I was gratified by diverse remarks made in a late number of the Galaxy, just come to hand in the farther end of Maine. He's pretending to be living in Maine. He may or may not be. I think he's in Boston and pretending to be living in Maine. On what I consider the right side of the presidential question. The reason he would pretend to be living in the farther end of Maine is because it was conservative, Jackson country. To be honest, sir, as we Jacksonians always are, I had sinister presentiments of what you might say, because Buckingham was liberal, when the time came for declaring yourself and taking sides. And that makes sense too. I think Buckingham was liberal, but he was more cautious than Matthew. It had been whispered about that you were getting notoriously cold in your political attachment to the military chieftain, were even overgrown with heresies like toadstools, so as to question, in the hearing of credible men, whether he is the greatest man now extant. The very next thing, in my opinion, to saying, as the manner of some is, that he deserves to be strung up like a mad dog for killing a few fellows that were fools enough to stand in the way of his pistol. That's a reference to dueling. Is this the respect due to dignity, services, and office to the governor of Florida, senator of the United States, the hero of 2 wars, who has done so much to exterminate the Indians? This is tongue-in-cheek now. This is sarcasm. Not to mention that glorious victory at New Orleans, which had the effect, unexampled in history, of saving the country even after peace was declared. So you get his sarcasm. This is a precursor to the Trismegistus that wrote Ensign Stebbings in the Boston Carpetbag. Same modus operandi, same person writing, you know. So that's just a sample. I could go on. I don't think I should here. We won't stretch these out unnecessarily. You get a sense of his intelligence, his satire, how sharp he was, how good a writer he was. So in May of 1828, he's still 15 years old because his birthday is July 18th. So he's still 15. Now we're going to go to his birthday. This is written on his birthday, July 18th, 1828. So he is just now 16 years old. And it's another one, Jacksonism down east, meaning in Maine. Mr. Editor, I was astonished at recognizing in the form of a printed communication the private admonition which I sent you the other day. And if I had not been, as Croker says in the play, the patientest man in the world, should have been vexed, grievously vexed. This is a little trick that Matthew loved to play, of pretending that his letter to the editor had been private and protesting that it had been published. They're friends. So, I think that Buckingham mentored young Matthew when he ran away from home. He kind of took him under his wing and became a surrogate father for him. So they have a close relationship. Matter of fact, it was so close, I think it made Buckingham's actual son, Edwin, who was a little bit older, made him jealous. So I feel. And I should mention that I do bring in my past life memory as another source with all the other sources. I don't assume that it's real necessarily. I don't use it exclusively, but it has its own weight. And the reason it has its own weight is I have objectively proven that it can sometimes be historically accurate. So knowing that, I respect it. I don't disrespect it the way a philosophical materialist would disrespect it. I give it its own weight. So sometimes it helps nudge me down the right path in the research. Whereas, for example, the people that have been helping me off and on during the years, they might go down a completely different path in their interpretation. Well, my first one did because she was a skeptic. My most recent one is intuitive, and she can go down the right path herself. As a matter of fact, when she would go into the library and start photographing pieces from, say, the Galaxy or some other newspaper that she thought might be Matthew's, her intuition was better than mine, because she would photograph things and I would look at it, and according to some preconception that I had read about in the historical record that was wrong, I would say, no, that couldn't be Matthew, or I was being overly cautious, And later I come back to it and say, wait a minute, she was right. That was Matthew. That happened a number of times. So, but the first one would go off in the wrong direction. So to continue, well, let that pass, for the trick was so diabolical, that's in italics, that I suspect yourself less than some of your officials to whom that epithet properly appertains. I think that's a reference to some of the other boys working on the paper, possibly even young Edwin, who gave Matthew a really hard time. And the reason they gave him a hard time, partly, is because he was so bright and he became like teacher's pet with Joseph Buckingham, and they were jealous. So there's another piece that he wrote that very clearly indicates that they were giving him a really hard time. So that's what that little reference was. And diabolical is a reference to printer's devils. So it means that the printer's devil, whoever that was giving him a really hard time. See, Matthew's work is so layered, and there's so many little hidden references in it, even at this age. At all events, I am harassed with troubles enough without quarreling with an old friend. So he says it. It sounds like he's the same age, but he's calling Joseph Buckingham an old friend. So you can see something of the relationship there. You must know that I meet a knot of my neighbors every Saturday night at the village inn to chew politics, and it vexes me to see the Adams men carry everything before them. So he's pretending to be a Jackson man who's upset that the Adams people are prevailing in the discussions. One of their company, and this is him, he's now going to describe himself in third person. One of their company is a young sprout of the law. He's pretending to be, in the law, which he isn't, but he has a legal kind of a mind. One of their company is a young sprout of the law who has had a sign fastened over his window 5 weeks and wears goggles. There is not a man among us can bandy words with that fellow. He shaves up everything we say as if his tongue were a gouge. So he's describing himself, that he beats them all. He's only 15, but he can beat every single one of them in debate, see. But Goggles has such a way of jingling them in our ears, just as Old Buck in the Antiquary, I don't know what that reference is forever boring his kinsman with the word phoca, no matter why. I don't know what that means either. See, a lot of these things, I can look them up, but I don't remember what the references are. Intellectually, cognitively, I don't remember these things. That he almost surfeits us, I don't know how you pronounce that, surfeits us with the very best thing we have to say. I have been since told there are some editors about who are gulled in the same style. Fie upon fools who will have their mouths gagged with their own arguments. Yea, hermetically sealed. He loved that term, hermetically sealed. If Jackson is not a, quote, military chieftain, what is he? And if we do not support him for his soldiery merits alone, in the name of common decency, why support him at all? Well, Matthew was a Quaker. Even though he'd run away from home, he was still a Quaker, anti-military and anti-war. So you can see that Matthew is adopting a character and then deliberately destroying that character's stance. See? This is pretty sophisticated stuff. This article goes on quite a ways. I won't continue it. It's quite clever. So that is Trismegistus on his birthday. And then we have one more on just about a year later, like one day before his birthday on the 29th. And this is brief. This shows that Matthew was skeptical about the things that Abby was trying to teach him. He was skeptical about all things paranormal, basically. And the reason is, I think, that his mother was superstitious and he had rebelled against that superstition. For example, all through his life, Matthew would make light of the devil in his works. And that's because his mother apparently made too big a deal of it. See? So here he says, March of Intellect. Misters Editors. The march of mind in this present age is at once attested and promoted by the practice of combining oral instruction with the display of figures, machines, models, and apparatus of various sorts. This practice, though of no very recent origin, is nowadays carried to a remarkable extent. It is found susceptible of application to a vast variety of objects. I make these remarks because there has recently been a very successful instance in a town not more than 1,000 miles distant, of lecturing upon superstitions with an apparatus. I have not yet been able to ascertain all the facts of this singular circumstance, which I regret, as I am sure that they would be interesting and instructive to your readers. Perhaps, however, my inquiries may be crowned with success, in which case I may be able to enrich your columns with a capital italicized ghost story. So this is Matthew the skeptic. Later on, he would be a spiritualist. So Matthew really transformed him in this regard. But this is what she was up against when she was teaching him and was secretly in love with him as a young girl, young lady. Here he is really mocking Hermes, adopting that pseudonym Trismegistus, and mocking the whole idea of being able to prove ghosts and so on, Well, she had her work cut out for her, but she could see his potential, and she was absolutely correct. So there's a couple more Trismegistuses, like I said, in 1835, which we needn't go into. And then there's a heavy presence of Trismegistus in the carpet bag, which he brings back in 1851. And there's much more early work. There's some going back, like I said, to the spring of 1825, I think before he ran away from home. There's one indication in his known series, Ethan Spike, that at least one of the reasons he ran away from home is that he wanted to get a higher education because he wanted to be an author, and presumably that's because he was already having success getting published in the New England Galaxy, which was a major literary paper in Boston, and he wanted to go to college, and he was denied that opportunity, probably because he was needed at home, and they really couldn't afford to send both him and John Greenleaf to the higher school. But he ran away from home, had a big fight, apparently, with his father, physical fight, and he ran away from home. This theme of running away from home shows up in Abby's stories. It shows up in his references. Apparently, he went to sea for a little while and ended up in Cuba and came back. There's little bits and pieces of this here and there. But that gives you an idea of Matthew as a child prodigy. All of his poetry, his young poetry, was humorous, as near as I can tell. There's very little serious poetry from these early years, maybe one or two. Even then, they have touches of humor in them. There's one about a beached whale where he kind of muses about the whale. And there's some humorous ones about the people that live in his boarding house in New York City. And there's some very funny ones. I've read some of them. One of them has to do with a young lady of 16 who ostensibly is writing for permission to marry, but says she'll already be married by the time he gets the letter. And, some great stuff. But no real serious poetry until Abby's influence. And she, I think, teaches him poetry, really teaches him, all the different styles and everything, because she was writing very sophisticated poetry as of age 14, most of which we know of because her classroom teacher in 1830, Albert Pike, the future Southern Civil War general and high-ranking Mason, stole her poems and published them under their joint initials AP, and then later claimed them and reworked them, and told his biographer in later years, he said, I never was able to write poetry as well as those early years. which is because it wasn't his poetry. So that's a whole nother subject. I don't think I'll write a paper on that. It's in my book, in my sequel especially. I go through all of the evidence for that and many of Abby's poems. But I just have the gut feeling that I don't think I want to drag that out in front of a skeptical audience necessarily. If anybody's interested, they can buy my sequel. They can look it up and read it. They can find it for themselves. But I don't think that I'll put it out there as shock value the way that I'm doing with these 4 papers that I'm publishing first in Real Paranormal Magazine UK and then making available for everybody on Academia EDU. There are a couple papers on Academia EDU about Abby's early work. One is about her poetry and one is about her prose, her stories, which you can look up. Find my name on Academia EDU, and those 2 papers are there. I think that I pretty much established that Mathew Franklin Whittier was a genuine, authentic child prodigy, unlike these 4 plagiarists. The only one that's really in question here is Edgar Allan Poe. And the question is, how much of this early work did he really write? And do you consider Tamerlane a sign of genius, you know? Clearly, it's somebody who thinks he's a genius. I don't think there's any question about that. And it's, you know, it shows someone educated and it shows someone intelligent, clever. I don't think there's any question that Edgar Allan Poe was intelligent. You know, lots of sociopaths are highly intelligent. The question is whether he was inspired. Well, he was clearly inspired by ambition. That comes through the poem. Just a little bit I scanned of it, you know. But when I say inspired, I mean something that worldly people don't understand because they haven't experienced it, you know. So there's a disconnect in me trying to communicate to worldly people what I mean when I talk about inspired literature. In the ancient days, it was said that one has a muse. You know, that's very much deprecated today. You know, it's watered down to the point where it doesn't really mean anything to have a muse. It means that you felt in the mood to write, you know, basically, and sat down and had nothing else to do and were kind of in the mood to write, and that was your muse. In the old days, it meant something quite literal, that there was a spirit in the higher realms, or there was something in the higher realms that was infusing you with inspiration and knowledge and wisdom, you know, and that you acted more or less as a channel for that. And your contribution was your technical abilities to get it into words and your ability to keep tuned in to that source. You know, that was inspired writing. Well, that's the truth. And what we have today is not. You know, the idea that inspiration or the idea that genius originally came from this idea of having a muse. But what we think of as genius now is what I would say is having a fast CPU on your computer, the ability to process information very quickly. That's genius. The ability to retain, you know, you have like a large hard drive, a whole bunch of memory, you know, and a very fast CPU. That's genius, supposedly, in the human being. It has nothing to do with genius as I define it. Genius is inspiration and the ability to write from inspiration from the higher spheres. Poe didn't have that, in my opinion. If it looks like he had it, that's work that he plagiarized, and that's how you can tell partly that he plagiarized it, because he didn't have that capacity. You know, as a very clever sociopath, he didn't have that ability to write inspired work. So where you see something inspired like The Raven, it wasn't his. The other ones don't really have any pretensions to being child prodigies, except Margaret Fuller, who was pushed into it by her father, but still only published. She went to college very early, but the only published work started at age 24, which is way late to be a child prodigy. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, if she didn't really write an essay on mind, then, you know, she certainly wasn't. And Dickens at age 21 with his Dinner at Poplar Walk, I would say definitely was not. So, but Mathew demonstrably here was. So it just makes it more plausible that he could have been the real author of these famous works. That's all. I won't drag this out anymore. I've got things to do today, and I hope you found this interesting, and I hope that some of you are actually watching the entire video. As a matter of fact, you might even want to post a little note. If you watched the whole thing, post a little note that says I watched all of it. That would give me an idea of how many people are actually watching to the end of these, as opposed to dipping in 5 or 6 minutes. And I mean, I'm guilty of this too. I've done this, so I can't really judge. But, watching 5 or 6 minutes and assuming that you understand the whole thing. I mean, I just did that with Tamerlane, but there's a lot of stuff in the middle that I've said that, like I said, basically answers the comments that are being put on my blog here. So again, thanks for watching.